She was not the bride he had ordered through the letters, but it was the little girl who looked at her and said, "God sent you to my father, a woman with a hidden past, a man who has lost all faith in love, and a child who has not spoken a word since the day his mother died." They meet in the cold winter of the American West, where the wind carries loneliness and hope touching each other in silence. If one day you are asked to live under a name that is not yours, would you dare to accept? If love comes from a lie, will you run away or stay to speak your truth? Because sometimes what moves the heart is not perfection, but the courage to love again, even though you know you might get hurt. Join me in the story of She Wasn't the Bride He Ordered, but His Daughter Said. God sent you after all, where love is found in the midst of loss, and forgiveness becomes the most beautiful thing people can give each other. If you also believe that love can heal, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this story. The afternoon train groaned as it pulled into the small station of Red Creek, Colorado, scattering dust and the scent of hot metal into the wind. It was late summer of 1889, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the tracks and left every living thing half dreaming. When the last passenger stepped down, a hush fell over the platform. She was a woman in her early 40s, wrapped in a plain gray travel dress that had lost its shine long ago. Her name was Margaret O'Connell, though she rarely spoke it out loud these days. She carried one worn-out valise, tied with a strip of faded blue ribbon. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat against the glare. Across the platform stood Jonas Whitaker, tall and weathered from years of sun and wind. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing the marks of field work that never quite washed away. In his coat pocket lay a letter, a promise written by a woman named Eleanor Simmons, a promise that had convinced him, after 3 years of loneliness, to try again. But the woman walking toward him was not the one from the photograph. Eleanor's letter had described herself as 29, fair-haired, blue-eyed. The woman now standing in front of him had dark auburn hair streaked with gray and eyes the color of river stone, older, calmer, and carrying something invisible, a history too heavy for her small frame. Jonas frowned, glancing down at the photograph once more. "This must be a mistake," he muttered. "I was expecting, I know," she interrupted quietly. Her voice was soft, a little rough at the edges, like someone unused to speaking too much. "I'm not the woman you wrote to." The words landed heavy between them, louder than the steam hiss of the train. Jonas' jaw tightened. "Then why are you here?" Margaret swallowed, glancing toward the empty tracks. The train was already pulling away. There would be no going back soon. Eleanor Simmons, she passed away 2 months ago. I was with her when it happened." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "She asked me to deliver her things and to tell you she was sorry she couldn't come." Jonas said nothing for a long time. A horse snorted nearby, breaking the silence. Finally, he spoke. "You came all this way just to tell me that Margaret nodded. That, and to make sure her little girl's letter didn't go unanswered." Jonas blinked. "My daughter's letter." "She wrote, asking when her new mama would arrive." Margaret's voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her throat. "I couldn't bear the thought of that child waiting with no one stepping off the train." The wind shifted, far out on the plain. A hawk cried once and was gone. Jonas's expression softened a fraction, but suspicion still shadowed his eyes. He studied her, this stranger standing where hope was supposed to arrive. "Ma'am." "I don't know who you are," he said at last. But I can't take in a stranger. Not with my little girl." "I understand," Margaret answered. "I just need a place to stay the night. Tomorrow I'll find another train east." She tried to smile, though it trembled. "I can pay my way. I can cook, sew, mend fences if needed." He hesitated. Something in her tone, the steadiness beneath the weariness, stirred an old echo of trust. "Boarding house is full this week," he muttered. "Rancher's Fair in town. I've got a spare room above the kitchen, just for the night." She inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker." The ride to his ranch was silent, but not empty. The horses' hooves beat a slow rhythm on the dirt road, matching the unspoken questions between them. Dust rose behind the wagon in a golden trail that caught the lowering sun. Red Creek spread out in miles of wheat fields and open sky. The Whitaker ranch stood at the edge of a dry creek bed, 2 miles from town, a white-painted house, a red barn, and fences that stretched farther than the eye could count. On the porch sat a small girl in a faded blue dress, her bare feet swinging above the steps. She didn't speak when the wagon stopped. She only looked up with wide hazel eyes, eyes that had seen too much silence. "Abby," Jonas said gently, "this is Mrs. O'Connell. She's passing through." The girl nodded once, clutching a small wooden horse in her lap. She didn't speak a word. Margaret smiled softly. "Hello, Abby," no answer. But the child didn't look away either. And for Margaret, that was enough. Inside, the house smelled of pine soap and quiet. Jonas showed her the small room above the kitchen, a bed, a wash basin, a window facing the western hills. "Water pumps out back," he said. "We eat at 6. She thanked him, set down her valise, and stood by the window for a long time after he left. The sun was melting into the horizon, pouring gold over the fields. In that light, even loneliness looked gentle. Margaret took a folded letter from her pocket, Eleanor's last words, and read it again under her breath. "If he's kind, stay a little while. Help him remember how to smile. Maybe that's what God meant for you." She folded it carefully and tucked it back against her heart. Dinner was a quiet affair. The only sounds were the ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Jonas ate mechanically. Abby pushed her food around her plate. Margaret, sitting across, felt every second stretch thin. At last she said, softly, "Your stew could use more time." Jonas looked up, startled. "You cook I used to, for the hospital, and for my brothers before they passed." She smiled faintly. "I can help tomorrow, if you'd like." He didn't answer, but he didn't say no either. After supper, as she washed the dishes, she caught Abby watching her from the hallway, silent, curious, not afraid. Later that night, when the house had gone still, Margaret sat by the window again. From somewhere in the dark, she heard faint notes of a harmonica, a slow, halting tune, uncertain at first, then steady. Jonas was playing maybe for himself, maybe for the wife he'd buried 3 winters ago. The melody drifted through the floorboards and settled around her like a prayer. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt something other than guilt, a small warmth flickering, fragile as a candle in wind. Maybe, she thought, she wasn't meant to leave just yet. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and silent, holding its breath for morning. Morning came with the smell of damp sage and the lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the fence line. A thin mist hung over the fields, turning the horizon pale silver. Margaret rose before the sun, as habit had taught her during years in hospital tents, and found herself standing barefoot on the porch, listening to the quiet breathing of the house. from the kitchen doorway. Jonas watched her for a moment. He had not expected her to rise early, nor to look as if she belonged there already, with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned loosely at her neck. When she turned, he cleared his throat. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Then I'd best earn it," she answered, taking the bucket toward the well. He followed her outside, not to help but to keep an eye. She worked steadily, drawing the water, pouring it into the trough. Her movements were practiced, careful, as though she feared to spill even a drop. "You done ranch work before?" he asked. "I've done whatever needed doing," she said, lifting her eyes to him. "Hard work keeps the mind still." It was the first morning in 3 years that he did not begin the day alone. Inside, Abby sat at the table with her small slate board, scratching letters in chalk. Margaret set a plate of corn cakes before her. "You're learning to write?" she asked. Abby nodded, shy but curious. Margaret bent down beside her. "Would you show me your name?" The little girl wrote slowly, "B." "That's lovely," Margaret whispered. "You know, my mother used to call me Maggie when I was small. You may too, if you like." Abby's eyes brightened just enough for hope to slip in. She took a bite, and for the first time, a faint hum escaped her, a fragment of the tune Jonas played the night before. Margaret felt her throat tighten. By mid-morning, the sun burned through the haze. Jonas saddled his horse for town. "I'll be gone a few hours," he said. "You can rest. I'll tend the garden." She replied, "It looks thirsty." He hesitated. "The soil's poor. Nothing's grown right since the last storm." "Then we'll coax it back," she said simply. "Sometimes ground just needs to be reminded it's still alive." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he rode away, leaving dust curling behind him like smoke. Margaret spent the morning working the soil behind the house. Abby brought her a tin cup of water now and then, watching closely as if studying a ritual. When the sun rose high, they rested beneath the cottonwood tree. Abby traced shapes in the dirt with a stick. Tiny houses, a river, a woman beside a child. Margaret recognized herself there, drawn in lines of dust. When Jonas returned, he found both of them asleep on the grass. The bucket tipped over, the sound of bees floating in the still air. He stood a long time before speaking. "You'll burn in this sun," he said finally. Margaret opened her eyes, startled, then laughed softly. "It feels good, being tired for something that matters." That night, she cooked supper rabbit stew thick with herbs and onions. The scent filled the house, warm and unfamiliar. Jonas paused at the doorway, breathing it in. "I hope I didn't overstep," she said. He shook his head. "It smells right." When they sat down, he bowed his head in brief prayer, a habit long neglected. Abby reached across the table, small fingers finding Margaret's hand. After the meal, the sky turned copper and violet. Jonas repaired a hinge on the barn door while Margaret gathered laundry from the line. Their movements wove together in a quiet rhythm of necessity, as if they had been doing it for years. The only sound was the whip-poor-will calling from the creek bed and the clink of tools against metal. Later, Jonas poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her on the porch. "I still don't know what to make of all this," he said. "A stranger shows up in place of another, and the house feels less empty." "Sometimes the wrong train takes you to the right place," she answered. "Maybe God works that way." He studied her face in the fading light. "You really believe that I have to?" she said. "It's the only thing that's ever kept me walking." The air cooled. The smell of rain drifted from the hills. Abby appeared at the doorway, clutching her wooden horse. She climbed onto Margaret's lap without a word. Jonas watched, his eyes softening. For a heartbeat, he saw not the stranger, but the quiet steadiness he had prayed for on lonely nights. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. Margaret lifted her gaze to the clouds. "Storm's coming," she murmured. Jonas nodded. "They come fast this time of year." He didn't tell her he still dreamed of the one that took his wife. As the first drops began to fall, they moved inside. Lightning flashed once, lighting the framed photograph on the mantel Eleanor's face. Forever young. Margaret's eyes lingered there. "She was beautiful," she said softly. Jonas set his cup down. "Yes, she was." Silence grew between them, not sharp but full of things unsaid. Then he turned to her. "She liked to sing when it rained. Said it kept the thunder away." "Then perhaps we should keep singing," Margaret whispered. But neither sang. They only listened as the rain drummed against the roof, steady and sure. When the storm passed, the world smelled new. Jonas lit a lantern and stepped out to check the animals. He found Maggie already there, shawl drawn tight, inspecting the fence line. "You didn't have to," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. "The wind reminds me of hospital tents. You learn to move when others rest." They stood side by side in the wet grass. Moonlight broke through the clouds, shining on puddles that mirrored the stars. Jonas turned to her. "You could stay a few more days till the road's dry." She looked at him, surprised. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," he said quietly. As they walked back, Abby's small figure appeared in the window upstairs, waving once before the curtain fell. For the first time in years, Jonas felt the strange peace of belonging. He didn't know what tomorrow would ask of him, only that tonight his house was no longer silent. And Margaret, lying awake later, stared at the ceiling beams glowing faintly in moonlight. She thought of the letter folded inside her valise, of the promise she had made to a dying woman. "I'll keep him company till he remembers how to smile." She turned on her side, listening to the slow rhythm of rainwater dripping from the eaves. Somewhere deep inside, something fragile began to root itself again, something she hadn't dared name in years. When she finally slept, it was to the sound of distant thunder fading over the open prairie, like a heart learning how to beat without fear. The sun rose slow and red over the ridges, turning the wheat fields to molten gold. Maggie woke to the smell of biscuits baking. She hadn't planned to sleep past dawn, but the storm had worn everyone out. When she came downstairs, Abby was already at the table, small fingers shaping dough under Jonas's watchful eye. "I thought you two could use breakfast," he said, without looking up. "Flour's cheap this week," Maggie smiled. "Cheap or not, that's fine work. Miss Abby, you'll make a baker yet." Abby's cheeks pinked. She wiped flour on her dress. Maggie rolled up her sleeves and joined them. Together, they filled the kitchen with quiet rhythm, the scrape of a bowl, the soft thud of dough, the hiss of the iron stove. Outside, a magpie called from the fence post. Inside, something lighter settled between them, almost like peace. Jonas poured coffee, handed her a cup. "You plan on staying long." "I'll move on soon," she said. "But the road's still muddy." He nodded. "No hurry." They ate together, the three of them, and when Abby dropped a spoon, Maggie laughed an easy sound that filled the room. Jonas froze for a heartbeat. He hadn't heard laughter in that kitchen since Eleanor's. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it deep as bone. The house was waking up. Later, Maggie helped Abby hang laundry on the line. The wind tugged the sheets till they billowed like sails. My brothers used to make tents out of these, Maggie said. Abby grinned, a flash of mischief. She pulled a clothespin from her pocket and clipped Maggie's sleeve to the line. Maggie gasped in mock outrage. Why, you rascal! The girl's giggle slipped out soft. Hi, startled as a bird's call. Maggie's breath caught. Jonas, watching from the barn, lowered his hammer in disbelief. He stepped closer. Did she? Maggie nodded. She did. Abby ducked behind the sheet, hiding her smile. That evening, Reverend Samuel Reed stopped by on his way back from town, his black coat dusted with road dirt. Jonas Whitaker, he said, shaking hands. I hear you've got company. Jonas stepped aside. Reverend, this is Mrs. O'Connell. She's staying a spell. Reed's gray eyes warmed. You have the look of someone who's seen hard miles. Ma'am. Maggie smiled faintly. A few. But the Lord's roads all lead somewhere, don't they? The Reverend chuckled. If you keep your heart open, they do. He stayed for supper. Abby sat close to Maggie the whole time, stealing glances at her face. When the Reverend offered grace, Maggie bowed her head. For what's lost, she whispered, and for what still grows. After the meal, Reed leaned toward Jonas. You look better than last year's harvest. Jonas shrugged. Maybe the soil's healing, or maybe the farmer is. The Reverend left under a sky strewn with stars. Jonas lingered at the doorway, watching Maggie tidy the table. Reed's a good man, he said. He thinks God sends us who we need. Do you believe that she asked? He hesitated. Some days. She nodded. That's enough. The following afternoon the heat rose sharp and dry. Jonas worked the north fence while Maggie tended the garden. Abby followed with a bucket of water, humming again that broken tune. Near dusk, a shout carried across the pasture a startled whinny, the crash of a gate. Jonas ran. One of the horses had spooked at a rattlesnake and reared, snapping the latch. Abby, standing too close, stumbled backward. Maggie didn't think. She lunged, grabbing the child and rolling them both clear as the animal's hooves struck the earth where Abby had been. Dust flew. Jonas hauled the horse aside, heart hammering. When the air cleared, Maggie was on her knees, arms scraped and bleeding. He crouched beside her. You hurt? Just a scratch. Her voice shook. She's all right. That's what matters. Abby clung to her, trembling. Jonas looked at the blood streaking Maggie's sleeve and felt something break open inside him, a crack wide enough for gratitude to rush through. He carried a basin of water and a clean cloth from the barn. She sat on the porch while he washed the cut, the air thick with the smell of iron and sweat and rain-soaked wood. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Yes, I did. He bound the wound with care. You've got the hands of someone used to saving others. I tried, she whispered. Sometimes it wasn't enough. He looked up. It was today. When Abby finally fell asleep that night, Jonas stayed by the window. Maggie joined him, her arm bandaged, hair loose from its pins. You ever miss where you came from? He asked. Every day. But some places stop waiting for you. He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. Mine did too. For a long while they listened to the crickets. Then he said, Abby laughed today. I know, Maggie said. It was the best sound I've heard in years. Me too. He didn't move closer, yet the distance between them seemed to dissolve. Outside, the moon rose full over Red Creek, silvering the fields. The scent of lilac drifted through the open window. Maggie spoke first. Do you believe laughter can heal? Jonas considered. Maybe it's not laughter itself. Maybe it's what comes before the courage to make a sound when silence feels safer. She looked at him, eyes shining. "Then your daughter's braver than most." In the morning, the air was fresh again. The roses by the porch dead twigs for 2 seasons had put out a single new leaf. Maggie touched it with her good hand and smiled. "See," she said when Jonas stepped outside. "Even the earth remembers how." He followed her gaze, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt the world turn forward instead of back. The first light of dawn found Maggie already outside, kneeling in the garden. Dew clung to her skirt, and the scent of damp earth rose around her. She loosened the soil with a small spade, humming under her breath the same tune Abby had tried to hum the night before. It felt like a prayer whispered through her hands. Inside, Jonas stirred the fire to life. The smell of coffee drifted through the open window. He watched her from the doorway, her figure bent over the ground, the hem of her dress dark with moisture. Something inside him stirred a feeling half worry, half wonder. "You'll ruin your knees out there," he called. She turned, smiling. "They've known worse." He stepped onto the porch, mug in hand. "You plan on growing anything in that patch, roses," she said. "Your wife planted them once, didn't she?" He hesitated, caught off guard. "How did you know I saw the dead stems? They're stubborn flowers. They sleep longer than most, but they remember." He didn't answer. He only nodded and went back inside, the echo of her words following him. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared to that deep, endless blue the Colorado plains keep for themselves. Maggie trimmed away the brittle branches, setting aside what might still root. Abby helped, passing her a tin of water and pointing to the smallest stem with a hopeful look. "That one," Maggie said softly, "has fight left in it." When the wind lifted, petals long gone turned to dust in the air, shimmering for an instant before vanishing. Maggie whispered, "Rest now, and press the stem into new soil." Abby watched her, eyes wide, as if witnessing something sacred. Later, Jonas came out carrying a pair of gloves. "Thought you might use these," he said. They were Eleanor's old gardening gloves, the leather cracked but clean. Maggie took them carefully. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. She'd want them used, not boxed away. They worked side by side the rest of the morning. Words were few, yet the silence between them grew comfortable, like shade after long sun. From the barn came the steady cluck of hens, the creak of wood, the heartbeat rhythm of the ranch returning to life. At noon, Maggie set a pan of biscuits on the windowsill to cool. Abby slipped one, burned her tongue, and laughed silently, clutching her mouth. Jonas caught her eye and chuckled. Maggie joined in. The sound, light as wind, drifted across the field. When Reverend Reed passed by on horseback, he reined in at the fence. "Jonas Whitaker," he called. "Seems the Lord's blessing your soil again." Jonas lifted his hat. "Maybe just good weather." The Reverend smiled. "Weather's his work, too." His gaze softened when he saw Maggie. "And you must be the new hand helping." "Only till the ground learns my name," she said. "That won't take long," he replied. "Red Creek remembers kindness." That evening, after chores were done, Maggie sat on the porch mending one of Abby's dresses. Jonas joined her, a small jar in his hand. "Liniment," he said, "for your arms. You're sunburned." She took it with a nod. "I'm used to worse burns." He studied her. "Hospital work." "Yes, during the war." Her voice dropped. "I learned to keep breathing when others couldn't." He said nothing, only looked out at the horizon. "That's a hard kind of learning." "It's what taught me to start over," she said. even when the world says not to. A long silence followed. Crickets began their chorus. The smell of sage rolled in from the hills. Jonas cleared his throat. "You said you came here because of Eleanor. Did she suffer much?" Maggie set down the needle. "Not for long. She was brave. Spoke your name before the end." He closed his eyes, jaw tight. "I sent her letters every month. Guess she never got to read the last." "She did," Maggie whispered. "I read it to her." He turned to her. "Then you were there when she—" "Yes." The lamplight caught the faint tremor of her hands. "She made me promise to come, to tell you she was grateful for every word." Jonas looked away, eyes glistening. "I should thank you. Then—" "You did what I couldn't." Maggie shook her head. "She saved me too. You just don't know how yet." He frowned, wanting to ask more, but Abby's small voice, soft, broken but real, floated through the door. Papa Jonas froze. It was only a whisper, but it was sound. "What is it?" Sweetheart Abby stood in the doorway, pointing toward the garden. "Bloom." They rushed outside, under the silver of the rising moon. One rosebud had opened a single, pale blossom trembling on its fragile stem. Jonas knelt, disbelief written across his face. "That plant's been dead 2 years." Maggie touched the petals gently. Sometimes things wait until someone's ready to see them again. He looked up at her, eyes catching the light. "I don't know what you are, Mrs. O'Connell, but you've brought something back to this place." She smiled faintly, just reminding it to breathe. The night stretched quiet and endless. When they went back inside, Jonas paused at the door. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll fix the old bench out front. You'll need a place to sit when those roses start showing off." "I'll hold you to it," she replied, "before sleep." Maggie opened her small journal and wrote one line. "Today." The earth forgave itself a little. She closed the book and listened to the stillness of the house, no longer empty, only resting. The week slipped by quietly, marked by the rhythm of ranch life hoofbeats, the creak of the windmill, the faint hum of Maggie's song as she worked. She had grown used to the sound of Jonas moving about the house, the low whistle he made when mending harnesses, the occasional laughter Abby let escape without realizing it. For the first time in years, the days didn't feel borrowed. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, the mail wagon rattled up the drive. Dust swirled around the porch as the driver lifted a battered trunk from the back. "Got something belonging to a Mrs. O'Connell," he said, tipping his hat. "Been following you clear from Kansas City." Maggie froze. Her valise, the one lost on the train, sat there, its leather cracked, the tag half torn. She paid the man, heart thudding, and carried it inside. Jonas was at the barn, Abby feeding chickens. Alone. She set the trunk on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside lay folded linens, a few books, and a small bundle of letters tied with string. Her hand shook as she untied them. On top was one envelope addressed in her own handwriting, never sent. The words stared back at her like ghosts. Reverend Samuel Reed, Red Creek, Colorado. Jonas's footsteps sounded behind her before she could hide it. "Everything all right?" She turned, startled. "Just old papers." He nodded toward the bundle. "Need help carrying it upstairs?" She shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I'll sort through later." But when she bent to close the lid, the letter slipped from her hand, landing face up. Jonas reached for it before she could move. "Reverend Reed." "You know him," Maggie hesitated. "We've met." Jonas frowned, studying the envelope, then looked back at her. Why write him? She drew a long breath. Because there are things I couldn't say out loud. He waited. She didn't explain. The air thickened with words unspoken. Finally, he placed the letter back on the table. You don't owe me explanations, he said quietly. You're free to do as you please. But his tone held something else hurt. Confusion. She saw it and felt her throat tighten. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jonas sat alone by the hearth. The wind had picked up again, tapping the shutters like impatient fingers. He glanced at the trunk still sitting near the stairs. Something in him, curiosity, fear, perhaps both pushed him closer. He lifted the lid. The letter lay on top where she had left it. He shouldn't have opened it, but loneliness made poor judges of men. He unfolded the paper under the lamplight and began to read. Dear Reverend Reed, I am bound for Red Creek as you advised, though I go not as myself. Eleanor Simmons died in my care 2 months ago. She made me promise to go in her place to deliver her belongings and, if I found kindness, to stay long enough that Mr. Whitaker might remember what hope felt like. I do not know if this is right. I only know I could not let the girl's letter go unanswered. Pray for me, for I carry another woman's promise, and I fear my own heart may betray me before the truth can. The words blurred. Jonas set the letter down slowly, as if it might burn through the table. Betrayal surged first, followed by something sharper. Grief, disbelief, a dull ache that left no room for breath. He stood, pacing the floor, hands clenching and unclenching. When Maggie came down for water, she found him waiting by the lamp, the letter open in his hand. Is it true? He asked, voice hoarse. She froze. Jonas, is it true? Yes, she whispered. Every word. He took a step back as though the space between them were a wound. You walked into my house under another woman's name, slept beneath her roof, tended her child. I never meant to deceive you, she said. I thought, you thought what? That I'd never know that you could live her life and call it mercy. Maggie flinched, but didn't look away. I came because she asked me to, because she believed you deserved more than emptiness. I stayed because I saw you trying to live inside a grave. His eyes flashed. You had no right. I know. Her voice trembled, but I loved that child before I knew what that love would cost. Silence stretched between them, thick as smoke. Abby's small footsteps sounded from upstairs, but she didn't come down. The house seemed to hold its breath. Jonas set the letter on the table with shaking hands. Pack your things. She blinked. Jonas, please. I can't. He swallowed hard. Every word you spoke. I wonder whose truth it was. Maggie stood still for a long moment. Then she nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. I'll leave by morning. When she turned away, he caught sight of her shoulders trembling. For a heartbeat, he almost called her back, but pride held his tongue. She walked upstairs, her footsteps fading into the dark. The fire burned low, crackling softly. Jonas sat beside it until dawn, the letter open on his knees. He tried to feel only anger, but beneath it lay something more dangerous, a sense of loss too deep to name. By the time the sun rose, Maggie's valise was packed. She left the gloves he had given her folded on the table beside a note written in careful hand. Thank you for letting me remember what home feels like. She stepped out into the cold morning air. The horizon stretched wide, endless. Behind her, the house stood silent, smoke rising thinly from the chimney. Abby watched from the window, one hand pressed against the glass. Maggie didn't look back. The sky was already bruised with gray when Maggie left the Whitaker ranch. The wind carried the smell of rain and something colder snow. Maybe, though it was too early in the season. She walked down the long dirt road that led toward Red Creek, her valise heavy in one hand and her shawl pulled tight with the other. Behind her, the land stretched empty and quiet, as if holding its breath after the truth had broken. She didn't know where she would go, only that she couldn't stay, not after the look in Jonas's eyes the night before. The sound of his voice steady, hurt, still rang in her ears. Every step away from the ranch felt like leaving behind the only peace she had known in years. At the house, Jonas stood by the window, watching her figure grow smaller until it disappeared beyond the ridge. Abby stood beside him, silent, her small hand clutching the edge of his shirt. "She's gone," she whispered, barely more than breath. Jonas nodded, unable to speak. Abby turned, ran to her room, and slammed the door. The wind rose, slamming the shutters. Outside, thunder cracked over the plains. By noon, the sky turned the color of pewter. Jonas went about the chores in silence, pitching hay, fixing the gate, pretending not to look toward the road. He told himself she was safe, that the stagecoach would take her east. But when the air grew sharp and the first flakes began to fall, a worry he couldn't name gnawed at him. The wind had changed direction. Storms like this could swallow a traveler whole. Abby appeared at the barn door, face pale. She held Maggie's handkerchief in both hands. She forgot this. She said. Jonas took it. The small square of fabric smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. His throat closed. "She'll be fine," he murmured, but the words sounded hollow. Abby shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She's alone. Papa." Before he could answer, the wind roared, scattering straw across the floor. The horses stamped nervously, sensing what was coming. A storm like this could strip paint from a house and drag cattle clear across a pasture. Jonas felt the decision form in his chest before he even thought it through. "Stay inside," he told Abby, grabbing his coat and lantern. She reached for his arm. "Please, don't I have to?" he said. "Lock the doors. If I'm not back by night, stay with Reverend Reed." She didn't let go. For the first time in 2 years, her voice came out clear, trembling but strong. "God sent her. Papa, you can't let her go." The words froze him in place. He looked down at his daughter, the child who had not spoken since her mother's death, and saw the same fierce faith he'd lost long ago. He pressed a hand to her cheek. "I won't," he said, and rode out into the storm. Snow came sideways, thick and blinding. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, bending them like reeds. Jonas could barely see 10 feet ahead, the lantern flickering in his hand. He rode along the road, calling her name against the roar of the storm. Maggie. The wind stole his voice, but he kept shouting. He found the first sign of her a mile from the house, a dropped glove half buried in snow. He dismounted, heart pounding. "Come on, girl," he urged the horse forward. Farther down, near the creek bed, the snow had drifted deep. The horse balked, and Jonas climbed down to search on foot. The cold bit through his coat. He stumbled once, twice, until he saw a dark shape by the fallen cottonwood tree. For a moment, he thought it was just shadow, but then it moved. Maggie. He fell to his knees beside her. She was crouched over Abby, shielding the girl's small body with her own. Abby. For a heartbeat, he couldn't understand what he was seeing, then realized the child must have followed her. Maggie looked up, her face streaked with snow and tears. "She got lost trying to find me," she gasped. I couldn't leave her. Jonas gathered Abby into his arms, checking her pulse, her breath. She was shivering, but alive. He turned to Maggie. "You'll freeze out here. We have to move." "I tried," she whispered. "But my leg." He looked down and saw the torn fabric, blood darkening her skirt. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms. She tried to protest, but he only said, "You're not walking another step." The wind howled, the snow rising around them like ghosts. Step by step, he carried them both toward the faint light of home. When his strength faltered, Maggie pressed her forehead to his shoulder. "I didn't mean to lie," she murmured. "I know," he said, voice rough. "You didn't steal another woman's life. Maggie, you gave us ours back." They reached the ranch long after dark. Reverend Reed had come when Abby failed to answer the door, and he helped Jonas bring them inside. The fire roared to life, throwing gold across the walls. Maggie lay on the couch, pale but breathing. Jonas knelt beside her, taking her cold hand. "Don't you dare leave now," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open. "I wasn't planning to." The Reverend laid a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "Seems the Lord sent the storm to remind you what you almost lost." Jonas looked at Maggie, her hair damp with melted snow, and felt something inside him settle, a long, quiet forgiveness he hadn't known he was capable of. Hours later, the wind began to fade. Abby slept curled beside Maggie, her small hand tangled in the woman's shawl. Jonas sat awake, watching the fire burn low. He didn't pray aloud, but the words came anyway, soft and sure. "Thank you for sending her." When dawn broke, the world outside was white and still, the fences buried, the fields glittering like glass. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the sharp air. Behind him, the house was warm again. Inside, Maggie stirred. She opened her eyes to the light pouring through the window and saw Jonas standing there, framed against the snow. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he smiled without pain. And in that smile, she understood some storms didn't come to destroy. They came to clear the air for grace to return. The snow held for 3 days, blanketing Red Creek in silence. Roads vanished. Fences disappeared beneath white drifts, and even the river seemed to slow its breath. Inside the Whitaker house, time softened. The fire never went out, and the smell of cedar smoke and coffee filled every corner. Maggie stayed in the front room, her injured leg propped on a pillow. Reverend Reed had done what he could before riding back to town, promising to return when the road cleared. "You're in good hands," he'd said, giving Jonas a look that said more than words. Jonas had barely left her side since. When she woke from fever dreams, she'd find him sitting in the rocking chair, head bowed, hands clasped as though he were still praying. Once, she whispered, "You should rest." He looked up, eyes tired but gentle. "I did. While you were breathing." By the second evening, color began to return to her cheeks. Abby rarely left her lap, reading from her little slate board or tracing letters with her finger on Maggie's palm. Sometimes she'd hum small, uncertain sounds, but it was enough to make Jonas stop whatever he was doing just to listen. On the 4th morning, light spilled through the frost on the windows like new hope. Maggie asked to sit by the fire. Jonas helped her to the chair and wrapped a quilt over her shoulders. "You saved her," he said quietly, nodding toward Abby. "If you hadn't found her?" Maggie shook her head. "No, you saved us both. You came." He gave a short laugh, rough with emotion. "I'd have ridden to the ends of the county if I had to." For a while they said nothing. The house creaked as the ice melted from the eaves. Maggie stared at the flames, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Eleanor died, she made me promise something. Not to fix you, but to remind you life wasn't done giving." Jonas's gaze dropped. "She always had more faith than I did." She believed in your kindness," Maggie said. "She said you'd forget how to show it, but not how to feel it." Jonas turned to her, eyes wet. "Did she suffer much?" "No. She went like a candle, in the wind soft. Steady. Sure. She wanted me to tell you she forgave the world before it even asked." Jonas closed his eyes. "And what about you, Maggie? Who do you forgive?" Her lips trembled. "Myself." Slowly. He reached out then, taking her hand carefully, as though afraid she'd vanish if he held too tight. "You didn't steal her place," he said. "You built something new where ashes were." She smiled faintly. "You make it sound holy." "Maybe it is," he said. That night, the snow began to melt in earnest. Roofs dripped, and the sound of water running through the eaves filled the quiet like a hymn. Maggie slept deeply for the first time since her arrival, her face turned toward the faint glow of the dying fire. Jonas stepped outside before dawn. The world had changed overnight. The field glittered with ice, and in the garden, beneath the broken branches, a single rosebud, frozen but alive, peeked through. He crouched beside it, brushing away the frost. "You stubborn thing," he murmured. When he returned inside, Maggie was awake, watching the light creep across the room. "It's beautiful out there," he said. "I can smell the thaw." She replied, "It smells like mercy." After breakfast, Abby insisted on helping with chores. Jonas hesitated but finally agreed, sending her to the barn to feed the chickens. Maggie listened to the muffled sound of the child's boots crunching through snow and smiled. "She'll speak soon," Jonas said from the doorway. "She already does," Maggie answered. "She just doesn't use words." Jonas leaned against the frame. "You've changed this place. I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," she said softly. "You believed me." Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Edna Larkin, the neighbor who'd lived 3 miles down the road since anyone could remember, stood there bundled in her shawl, cheeks red from the cold. "Well, I'll be," she said when Jonas opened the door. "Thought you'd gone and buried yourself again. Heard tell you had company." Jonas smiled faintly. "Come in. Edna, we got coffee on." She glanced at Maggie and her bandaged leg, eyes narrowing but not unkind. "So this is the lady. Folks been whispering that you got yourself a miracle worker." Maggie chuckled softly. "Just a stubborn gardener." Edna nodded approvingly. "That's near the same thing, if you ask me." The old woman stayed an hour, trading stories and gossip, before hitching her wagon again. As she left, she winked at Jonas. "Don't let this one wander off. You hear after she was gone." Jonas stood by the window, staring at the faint tracks her wagon left in the slush. "People are going to talk," he said. "They always do." Maggie replied, "Let them. Talking's better than silence." That evening, he brought his guitar down from the attic, dusted it off, and sat near the fire. "Didn't think I'd ever play again," he said. "Why not?" He plucked a string, the sound soft but clear. "Didn't seem right without her." "Then maybe it's time," Maggie said. "Play for both of them her memory and the life still here." He began slowly, fingers stiff, the melody uncertain. But soon, the old rhythm found him. Abby came running, hair flying, and curled beside Maggie's chair, listening. When Jonas looked up, he saw both of them bathed in firelight, the woman and the child, who had somehow mended what he thought was beyond repair. When the song ended, Maggie whispered, "That was beautiful." Jonas set the guitar aside. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to hear laughter in this house. You brought it back." She looked at him, eyes shimmering in the low light. It was never gone. It was only waiting. Outside, the last of the snow slid from the roof with a heavy sigh. Spring was still weeks away, but the world already smelled of new beginnings. As Jonas banked the fire for the night, Maggie spoke softly, almost to herself. "You once asked if I believed God sends the right people at the wrong time. I think He does, but sometimes the time wasn't wrong at all. It just needed to break first." Jonas turned, his gaze steady. Then maybe the breaking was the blessing. Neither spoke again. The room filled with the small sounds of the house settling, the ticking of the old clock, the faint hum of wind outside. Abby, half asleep, leaned her head against Maggie's arm, and for the first time she whispered without fear. Mama Maggie froze, eyes filling, but Jonas only reached out, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. "She's right," he said quietly. "God did send you, after all." By early March, the world had shaken off the last of its frost. The hills beyond Red Creek turned the color of sage and honey, and the sound of running water filled the air. Every year when the thaw came, the townsfolk held a small fair part market, part church gathering, part excuse to remember that life went on. Jonas hadn't been in years. This time, Abby begged to go, her eyes bright, her laughter ringing like a bell that had finally remembered its tone. Maggie had healed enough to walk without the crutch, though she still limped when she was tired. "You two go ahead," she said, tying a ribbon in Abby's hair. "I'll mind the house." Jonas hesitated. "You sure?" she smiled. "I've had enough storms for one season. You go. Enjoy the sunshine." But as the wagon rolled down the dirt road and disappeared into the curve of the valley, she felt an unexpected hollowness. The quiet of the ranch was different now, no longer comforting, but echoing. She stood by the window, watching dust swirl in the distance, and realized that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being a visitor. This place had become her own heartbeat. Down in town, Jonas felt the same tug. Red Creek was alive with color bunting strung between poles, fiddles playing, the smell of fried dough and roasted corn drifting on the breeze. He lifted Abby down from the wagon, his hand instinctively brushing the ribbon in her hair. "Stay close. You hear." "Yep, Papa," she said, and the sound of her voice still startled him in the best way. "Mrs." Edna Larkin waved from her booth. "Well, look who crawled out from the hills and brought sunshine with him." Jonas tipped his hat. "Can't keep her cooped up forever." Edna grinned. "And where's your lady gardener home?" he said simply. "Shame," she replied, lowering her voice. "Town's been curious about her. Some say she's a healer. Some say she's a widow. Either way, she's good for you." Jonas laughed softly. "Maybe she's just herself." Edna's eyes twinkled. "Those are the dangerous kind." As the afternoon wore on, Jonas found himself glancing toward the road, half expecting to see Maggie appear. Abby tugged his sleeve, handing him a wildflower crown. "For Miss Maggie," she said shyly. He nodded, voice rough. "She'll like that." Back at the ranch, Maggie busied herself with the garden. The earth, dark and soft, yielded to her hands. Beneath the rose bushes, new shoots had sprouted, small and fierce. She brushed away the soil and whispered, "Welcome back." She didn't hear the rider approach until the sound of hooves echoed against the porch. When she looked up, Sheriff Clay Donovan was dismounting, hat in hand. "Afternoon, ma'am. Sorry to bother you." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Sheriff, what brings you this far out?" He glanced toward the road. "Just checking in. Heard there was some commotion last month. Storm rescue and all. Folks talk." She smiled faintly. "They always do." He nodded, awkward. Jonas is a good man. Hard-headed, but good. Town's better when he shows his face. "I think he's remembering that," she said. The sheriff studied her for a moment, eyes kind. "You staying long?" She hesitated. "That depends on whether I'm wanted." "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "you'd have to be blind not to see that you are." After he left, the house felt too still again. Maggie stepped onto the porch, gazing down the long road to town. The horizon shimmered with heat, and far off, she thought she could hear laughter carried on the wind. She smiled, closed the door behind her, and began preparing supper just in case. When Jonas and Abby returned that evening, the smell of stew and fresh bread met them halfway up the path. The porch lantern glowed warm against the darkening sky. "Something smells like home," Jonas said. "It is home," Abby whispered, running ahead. Maggie met them at the door, wiping flour from her hands. "You didn't have to rush back," she said, though her eyes softened at the sight of them. Jonas handed her the crown of wildflowers. "This is from Abby." She took it carefully, pressing it to her heart. "It's beautiful." Abby beamed. "We won a pie contest. Did you now?" Maggie laughed. "I'll expect a lesson, then." During supper, they shared stories from the fair Abby's first dance, the preacher's speech, the way the town band missed half their notes. Maggie listened, a laughter rippling through her like warmth after cold. For the first time, she felt she could breathe without remembering what it had cost her to start again. Later, when Abby went to bed, Jonas lingered by the fire. The sheriff came by, Maggie said quietly. Jonas looked up. "What for checking in?" "He said the town misses you." He snorted. "They just miss my taxes." She smiled. "He said you're a good man." He stared into the fire. "I wasn't, for a long time." "You grieved," she said. "That's not the same as being lost." He looked at her then. Really looked the lines around her eyes, the strength beneath her gentleness. "And what about you, Maggie? What were you before you came here?" She thought for a long time before answering. Someone who thought love was for other people. Someone who patched up wounds but never let anyone touch her own. Jonas's hand rested on the table, fingers brushing hers. "And now," she said softly, "I'm learning that healing isn't always quiet. Sometimes it sounds like laughter from a kitchen." The silence that followed was easy, full, outside. The night sang with crickets. The air smelled of lilac and ash. Jonas stood, poured 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one. "To the wrong bride," he said, a faint smile tugging his mouth. Maggie tilted her head. "Wrong." He met her eyes. "No. The one I didn't order, but the one we needed." She laughed, shaking her head. "That's a terrible proposal." He grinned. "Wasn't one." Her smile softened. "Good. Because I'm not ready to say yes yet." He nodded, accepting the challenge. "Then I'll keep asking, in quieter ways." When she went to bed that night, the wildflower crown hung above the window. The scent of the fair lingered in the air hay. Sugar, and the faint promise of something just beginning. As the house settled into sleep, Maggie whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Eleanor." And for the first time, She felt sure the woman she had once promised to honor was smiling somewhere beyond the horizon. The next few weeks passed in a hush of ordinary beauty. The mornings came bright, dew collecting on fence rails, and Maggie could finally walk across the yard without her limp slowing her too much. Jonas had repaired the front bench, just as he'd promised, sanding it smooth until the wood shone like honey. Every evening they sat there with Abby between them, watching the sun drop behind the far ridge, the light spilling across the plains like molten gold. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Silence between them had stopped feeling like absence. It had become its own language, one that said everything the mouth could fumble to express. But one evening, when the sky bruised purple and the crickets began their low hum, Maggie brought out a box small, worn, tied with faded blue string. "These are my letters," she said, "ones I never sent." Jonas frowned, curious but cautious. "To who? Mostly to myself," she said, with a wistful smile, "and sometimes to God, when I wasn't sure which of us was listening." She opened the box. Inside were folded pages, edges yellowed from travel. She took one out and began to read, her voice soft, like a hymn carried on the wind. "March 3rd, somewhere in Kansas, I watched the train leave without me today. I told myself it was only a delay, but I think part of me wanted it to leave. It's hard to chase something when you're not sure what you're running toward." She stopped, exhaled, eyes glistening. "I wrote that the day Eleanor died." Jonas' jaw tightened. He looked down, tracing a line on the wood rail with his thumb. "You must have seen some hard things." "I did," she said. "But worse than watching someone die is watching someone stop living long before their body quits. I was doing that to myself." Jonas looked up at her. "You're not anymore." "No," she said quietly, "because someone taught me how to look at the world again without flinching." The night deepened around them. Fireflies blinked over the garden, and Abby, sleepy from the day's play, leaned against her father's side. Jonas brushed her hair from her face, murmuring, "Time for bed, little one." Abby nodded, hugging Maggie good night before slipping inside. When the door closed, Maggie folded her letters and set them on the bench. "I thought I'd burn them," she said, "but maybe it's better to keep them, to remember who I was before hope found me." Jonas watched her in the half-light. "I've got things I haven't faced, too," he said after a moment. "Letters I never wrote. Words I should have said to Eleanor, to Abby, to God." Maggie looked at him gently. "Then say them now." He gave a small, uncertain laugh. "To you, to the night," she said. "It keeps secrets." Jonas leaned back, the sound of frogs rising from the creek below. "All right, then." His voice was rough at first, like a man learning to pray again. "Eleanor, I'm sorry I stopped talking to you long before you left. I thought shutting down was strength. Turns out, it was just cowardice. Abby's fine now." She laughs again. "I think you'd like the woman who made that happen." Maggie's breath caught. Jonas turned his gaze toward her. "And to whoever's listening up there, thank you for sending her, even if she didn't come the way we expected." The words hung in the air, tender as the glow from the lantern beside them. For a while, neither moved. The night wrapped them close. Finally, Maggie whispered, "You know what I miss most about letters." "What's that?" "They make you choose your words carefully. When you speak, you can rush, stumble, take them back. But when you write, you have to mean every line." Jonas smiled faintly. "So if you were writing one now, what would it say?" She turned to him, eyes bright under the moonlight. It would say, "Thank you for teaching me that forgiveness can sound like laughter, that even broken hearts can keep time." He looked down at the box of letters, then back at her. "Mind if I keep one? They're not much to read." "I'm not asking to read," he said. "Just to keep." She nodded, touched, "Then take one." He reached in, pulling a folded page at random. She didn't ask which. Some things were better left to faith. Inside the house. Abby stirred in her bed, dreaming of rose gardens and warm hands and music drifting through open windows. When Jonas and Maggie finally stood, the bench creaked softly beneath them. He walked her to the door, lingering there in the lamplight. "You said once you weren't ready to say yes," he murmured. "Still true." She smiled faintly. "Ask me when the roses bloom again." "I will," he said, and his voice carried a quiet certainty that felt like a vow. Later, when the house had gone still. Maggie took out her journal again. She wrote a single line before blowing out the lamp. Sometimes love begins with the letters we never send, but somehow they still find their way home. In the faint glow of the moon, the garden outside shimmered with the promise of coming spring. The roses slept under the soil, waiting for warmth to wake them, just as the hearts in that small house, once cold and sealed, were now learning how to open again. Spring came slowly to Red Creek that year. The snowmelt fed the river until it ran glassy and full, and the hills turned the color of wild thyme. The morning smelled of rain and new grass. Maggie woke earlier with every dawn, her energy returning as surely as the sun. The garden was alive again. Rows of green shimmered under dew, and at the far end of the fence, the rose bush that had once been nothing but brittle twigs now bore buds thick as pearls. She would pause there every morning, touching one tenderly with her fingertips, murmuring, "You made it." Jonas pretended not to watch her, though he always did from the porch, from the barn, from wherever he was working. There was something sacred about the way she moved through the world, like she was still learning how to belong to it and teaching him the same lesson by accident. Abby followed Maggie everywhere. The child's voice grew stronger every day, her silence broken now by songs, laughter, and the kind of small chatter that made a house sound alive again. Sometimes Jonas would stop mid-task just to listen to the rhythm of her talking with Maggie, gentle, soft, full of questions about flowers, about God, about her mother. One afternoon, while Jonas was repairing a fence post, Maggie and Abby brought him lemonade. The sky was cloudless, the air sweet with the scent of wild clover. "You missed a nail," Maggie teased, pointing at the crooked line of boards. Jonas grinned. "You planning to hire out your services as foreman now?" "Someone's got to keep this ranch standing straight," she said. Abby giggled, handing him the cup. "She's better at bossing than you are." "Papa." Jonas took a long drink, laughing. "I don't doubt it." The laughter faded into something quiet but warm. Maggie leaned against the fence, looking over the field that spread toward the horizon. "It's a good place," she said softly. "Strong, steady, like its owner." He studied her face, trying to read what lay behind the words. "And what about you, Maggie O'Connell? You still planning to move on?" She hesitated, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "I told myself I would when I came here. I thought staying would mean I'd broken my promise to Eleanor." Jonas nodded slowly, and now Maggie's gaze drifted toward the house where Abby's laughter carried faintly through the window. "Now I think maybe promises change shape when love's involved." That night, as the sun bled orange across the plains, Reverend Reed arrived on horseback. his Bible tucked under one arm. "Heard your garden's the talk of the county," he said with a grin as Jonas helped him dismount. "Don't credit me," Jonas said. "That's Maggie's doing." The Reverend tipped his hat to her. "The Lord sends gardeners to tend hearts before soil." Maggie smiled. "Then I reckon I've had plenty of both." Over supper, the Reverend spoke of the town's plans for a midsummer service by the river, a celebration for new beginnings after a hard winter. "You should come," he said to Jonas. "Bring the girl. Folks miss seeing you among them." Jonas hesitated. "We'll think about it." Reed's eyes softened. "Thinking's good. Acting's better." When he left, the house felt full of something unspoken. Jonas poured coffee for them both and sat across from Maggie. "You think he's right? About coming back to town, about new beginnings." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I think we've already started ours." Weeks passed. The day of the river service came bright and warm. Maggie braided Abby's hair with ribbons while Jonas hitched the wagon. The road into town was lined with wildflowers, the air alive with the hum of cicadas. As they approached, Maggie felt a pang of fear-old habits, the urge to stay unseen, but Jonas reached over, laying a steady hand over hers. "You belong here," he said simply. "At the riverbank." The townsfolk gathered in clusters, laughter and music rising like sunlight. Children ran barefoot through the shallows. Women spread quilts on the grass. When Reverend Reed began to speak, his voice carried gently over the water. "Every winter buries something," he said, "and every spring returns it, changed, but alive." Maggie stood with Abby beside Jonas, her hand finding his without thought. The words sank deep, touching the quiet ache that still lived inside her. When the hymn began, Abby's small voice joined the others, clear, bright, unafraid. Maggie felt tears gather, but they didn't fall. They weren't from sadness. They were from knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. Afterward, as people milled about, Edna Larkin came over, eyes shining. "Well, look at you two," she said, nodding at Maggie and Jonas. "About time the Lord stitched up this town's loneliest souls." Jonas laughed, shaking his head. "Careful, Edna. You'll start rumors." "Too late for that," she replied, winking. "Now come help me with the pies before someone burns them." That evening, back at the ranch, the air was thick with the scent of roses. The first full bloom had opened a deep crimson flower glowing in the twilight. Maggie bent close, inhaling its sweetness. "Eleanor's roses," Jonas murmured behind her. She turned. "No," she said softly. "Ours now." He nodded, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "You remember that letter you let me keep, I do." He handed it to her, worn and creased from his keeping. "I never read it, but I added something to it. Curious." She unfolded it. Beneath her handwriting, in his careful scrawl, was a single line. "If love is a second chance, I'm ready to take it." She looked up, eyes shining. "Jonas." He stepped closer, voice quiet. "I meant it." Her breath caught. The world seemed to hold still, the wind, the light, even the birds. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it's time I said yes." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and softened every scar grief had left behind. "Finally," he said, and as the sun sank behind the hills, turning the sky gold and rose red, the first petals drifted down, scattering across their joined hands like a blessing. Summer settled over Red Creek like a warm blanket. The fields rippled gold beneath the wind, and the air smelled of hay and sweet water. Life at the Whitaker ranch found its rhythm again, steady, grounded, whole. Each morning, Jonas and Maggie worked side by side, the easy comfort between them deepening in the way of things not forced. Abby's laughter followed them through every chore. She had taken to singing as she gathered eggs, her small voice twining with the sound of the windmill. One evening, after a long day mending fences, Jonas returned to the house to find Maggie writing at the kitchen table. Candlelight brushed across her hair, turning it to threads of copper. She didn't notice him right away. Her brow was furrowed, her lips moving faintly as she read what she'd written. "What are you working on?" he asked. She looked up, startled but smiling. "A letter? Not one I'll send. I think just a way of setting things right in my own heart. May I ask to who? To Eleanor," she said softly. "I've been meaning to for a long time." Jonas pulled out a chair across from her. "Then maybe I'll write one too." She smiled at that. "I'd like that." They sat together, the quiet scratching of pens the only sound in the room. The candle flickered, casting two long shadows that met across the table. When Maggie finished, she folded her paper carefully, tying it with a piece of twine. Jonas reached for her hand. "What did you tell her?" "That her roses finally bloomed," she said, "and that she was right. Grace comes to us when we least deserve it." He nodded, eyes soft. "Then I'll tell her the same, and that I kept my promise to live again." They stepped outside together. The night was thick with crickets, and the sky burned with stars. Down by the creek, fireflies pulsed like scattered embers. Jonas carried a small tin box. "I thought we'd bury them," he said, "so they'll stay part of this land." Maggie hesitated, emotion tightening her throat. "That's a fine idea." They dug a small hollow beneath the oldest rose bush. Maggie laid her letter inside first, then Jonas. When he covered them with soil, she whispered a prayer, half thanks, half farewell. Jonas stood close beside her. "You think she'd approve." Maggie looked up at the night sky, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think she's been waiting for this." The days stretched long and golden after that. They planted more vegetables, repainted the barn, and fixed the roof before the next season's storms. Life, once fragile, now carried weight and meaning again. One afternoon, Maggie took Abby into town to visit Edna Larkin. The older woman poured lemonade and eyed her guest with knowing affection. "So," she said, leaning forward, "when's Jonas going to make it official?" Maggie nearly choked on her drink. Edna, "Oh, don't play coy. I see the way he looks at you. The man's been half in love since the day you stepped off that stagecoach." Maggie laughed, blushing. "He hasn't said anything." Edna chuckled. "He's a Whitaker. They're all words like fence posts strong, straight, but planted deep. You'll have to tug 'em out yourself if you want a confession." When Maggie and Abby returned to the ranch, the sun was dipping low. Jonas was waiting on the porch, a hammer in one hand, his shirt sleeves rolled up. "Thought you'd gone and joined the Gossipers Guild," he teased. "Maybe I did," she said, stepping closer. "Edna says you're terrible at saying what you mean." He grinned. "She's not wrong. Then maybe start practicing." He set the hammer aside. "You sure practice makes perfect?" Jonas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady and kind. "All right, then. Maggie O'Connell, when I asked God to send help, I didn't think he'd answer by sending someone stubborn enough to argue with me about fence lines. But now I know better. You're my answer." Her heart fluttered. "That's a fine practice round." "Then here's the real thing," he said, voice dropping low. "Stay. Not just through the harvest. Not just until Abby grows up. Stay for good. For a moment." The world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of hay, the hum of crickets, the weight of words that meant forever. Maggie reached up, fingers brushing his cheek. "You're sure I've never been sure of anything in my life?" She smiled, tears glinting in the fading light. "Then yes, I'll stay." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since grief had hollowed him, Jonas Whitaker felt whole. Abby peeked through the window, clapping her hands silently before racing to the garden, where the first fireflies had begun to rise. Later that night, they sat together on the porch as the moon climbed high. Jonas poured coffee for them both, the mugs warm in their hands. The air smelled of roses and summer rain. Maggie leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You ever think about how strange life is?" she said softly. "How so I came here pretending to be someone else? I thought I was bringing a message for a dying woman's husband. Turns out, I was the one being delivered." Jonas smiled. "Maybe that's how grace works. We think we're the messenger until we realize we're the miracle." She laughed quietly. "That's awfully poetic for a rancher. Don't tell Edna. She'll never let me live it down." The stars burned above them, bright and unblinking. The world, once broken, had found its rhythm again, inside. Abby's soft humming drifted from her room, a lullaby she'd learned from Maggie. Jonas listened, his arm tightening around the woman beside him. "Home sounds different now," he said. "It should," Maggie whispered. "It's got two hearts beating in it again." And as the night deepened around them, the ranch once haunted by silence breathed easy, alive with laughter, love, and the quiet promise of everything still to come. The heat of summer lingered longer than usual that year, pressing down on Red Creek until even the crickets fell silent at midday. The ranch thrived, cattle fattened, fields ripened, but Jonas sensed a change coming in the air, like the pause before thunder. He didn't say it aloud, though Maggie seemed to feel it too. One morning, a dust cloud appeared down the road. Jonas shaded his eyes, squinting. "Stagecoach," he murmured. "Too early for the mail." When it stopped at the gate, a stranger stepped down, a tall man in a worn city coat, carrying a leather satchel. His boots were too clean for ranch dirt. He tipped his hat politely. "Pardon the intrusion. I'm looking for Mrs. Margaret O'Connell." Maggie, standing on the porch, froze. Jonas turned to her, brow furrowed. "You know him." The man smiled faintly. "Name's Daniel Hart. I was her husband's lawyer." A sharp stillness swept through the yard. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. Jonas's expression changed confusion, then something like understanding. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. Maggie drew a slow breath. "My late husband," she corrected, her voice trembling only slightly. "Mr. Hart? I wasn't expecting no, ma'am," Daniel said gently, "but I owed it to you to deliver this in person." He opened his satchel and withdrew an envelope, its edges sealed with wax. "Your husband's estate has finally settled. There's a letter inside his last. It took years to reach me, and longer still to find you." Maggie stared at it, unable to move. The letter might as well have been a ghost. Jonas stepped closer, uncertain whether to speak. "Thank you," she managed at last, taking the envelope with trembling hands. Would you like water? It's a long ride from Denver." He smiled kindly. "Thank you, ma'am, but I'll be on my way. My business is done." With a nod to Jonas, he climbed back into the coach and disappeared in a trail of dust. When the sound faded, Maggie sank into the porch chair, staring at the envelope as if it might vanish if she blinked. Jonas knelt beside her. "You don't have to open it." "I do," she whispered. "It's the last part of who I was." Inside. The house was cool and quiet. She broke the seal carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, steady, familiar in a way that cut deep. "My dearest Maggie," it began. She read in silence, lips moving faintly. Jonas waited near the window, his hands clenched at his sides. When she finished, she folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. "He forgave me," she said softly. Jonas turned. "Forgave you for what?" "For surviving him," she said. "For leaving before I'd truly grieved. He wrote that if I ever found a place to belong again, I should let it claim me. He said love doesn't end. It changes form." Jonas exhaled slowly, the tension in him easing. "Sounds like he was a wise man. He was kind," she said, tears glimmering, "and he'd be glad for you." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jonas crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You don't owe me or his memory anything, but I'll spend every day earning the right to stand beside both of them." Her smile trembled. "You already have." That evening, as twilight deepened, Maggie walked out to the rose garden. She knelt among the blooms, the letter still in her hand. "Thank you," she whispered to the soil, "for teaching me how to love twice without shame." Behind her, Jonas approached quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside her. "You all right?" She nodded. "It feels strange, saying goodbye when I didn't know I still needed to." He looked out over the field where the horizon burned gold. Sometimes goodbyes are what make room for beginnings. Later that night, after Abby was asleep, Jonas lit a lamp and found Maggie sitting by the window, staring at the stars. The letter lay folded on the table. "Can I ask what it said?" At the end, he said softly. She hesitated, then handed it to him. "You should read it." He unfolded it, scanning the last paragraph. "If you find someone who steadies your heart, don't look away for my sake. Love again. Maggie, that will be the only proof that ours was real." Jonas lowered the letter, eyes glistening. "He gave you his blessing." She nodded. "And now I can give myself one, too." The wind rattled the window, soft and low. Maggie reached for his hand, her touch light but certain. "Do you ever think the people we lose still walk beside us?" Jonas thought of Eleanor, of long winters spent talking to a photograph. "I think they do," he said, "just quieter than before." She smiled. "Then maybe he and Eleanor are somewhere, laughing at how long it took us to get here." Jonas chuckled softly, probably shaking their heads. A peaceful stillness filled the room. Outside, the roses shimmered silver in the moonlight, bending in the wind like witnesses. Maggie leaned against his shoulder. "I think I'll keep his letter," she said, "not as a memory, but as proof that we can love more than once without betraying what came before." Jonas wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Then we'll keep it together." The clock ticked, steady as a heartbeat. The night stretched wide and forgiving. And somewhere beyond the walls of the little house, the past finally lay down to rest, leaving the present free to breathe. When they went to bed, the letter rested on the windowsill beside a vase of roses, petals open and fragrant. The moonlight fell across the page, soft as a benediction. By late August, the first signs of storm season swept across the Colorado plains. The air grew restless, heavy with thunder before the sky even darkened. Maggie could smell it, the same metallic edge that had once meant danger, now simply a reminder of how far she'd come. Jonas was in the barn when the wind first began to stir, checking the roof for loose boards. Abby chased the chickens inside their coop, giggling as feathers flew around her like snow. Maggie stood on the porch, watching the light shift from gold to gray. "It's coming quick," she called. Jonas stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's the way of things here. One moment calm, next moment chaos." She smiled faintly, like people. He gave a low laugh. "You calling me unpredictable? Only when you try to fix everything at once," she teased. The first drops of rain struck just as they herded the animals into shelter. Thunder cracked in the distance, echoing off the hills. By the time they reached the house, the rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof like 1,000 heartbeats. Inside, the lamps flickered. Abby pressed her face to the window, wide-eyed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jonas crouched beside her. "You're not scared?" She shook her head. "Not when you're here." Maggie met Jonas's gaze, something soft and deep passing between them, an understanding that steadiness wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stay through it. As the storm raged, they gathered in the parlor. Maggie lit more candles, the warm glow cutting through the dark. Jonas stoked the fire while Abby curled on the rug, sketching in her small notebook. "You remember the flood 5 years back?" Jonas asked quietly. "Took out half the north pasture." Maggie nodded. "You rebuilt it." "After losing Eleanor, I thought maybe rebuilding things would fix me too," he said. "It didn't. But you made me want to build again for the right reasons." She looked at him, heart tight. "You didn't need me for that, Jonas. You just needed to remember who you were." "Maybe," he said, "but remembering's easier with someone beside you." Lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a breathless second. His face, her hand near his, the shadows trembling on the wall. Then darkness again, filled with the sound of rain. They stayed like that for hours, talking in the low rhythm of people who no longer feared silence. Maggie told stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of apple orchards and long winters, of how her mother used to hum hymns while quilting. Jonas shared tales of the early ranching days, when Red Creek had been little more than a scattering of shacks and dreams. At one point, Abby fell asleep with her head in Maggie's lap, her small hand resting on her sketchbook. Maggie brushed the girl's hair gently aside, voice barely above a whisper. "She's thriving. She's alive again," Jonas said. "You did that?" "No," Maggie murmured, smiling. "We did that." The storm began to ease near midnight. Rain softened to drizzle, thunder retreating over the distant ridge. Jonas stood and stretched, his joints cracking. Roof held. "That's something." "You doubted your handiwork," she teased. He chuckled. "Never hurts to be grateful when things stay standing." Maggie rose too, careful not to wake Abby. She crossed to the window, watching lightning fade behind the hills. The air smelled clean, new. "Do you think it's foolish?" she said quietly. "That part of me still expects storms to take something away." Jonas joined her, resting a hand on the window frame beside hers. "No," he said, "but sometimes they give something back, too." She turned to him. "What do you mean?" He looked out into the dark, voice steady. "After the flood, the soil was richer. The next year's crops grew twice as tall. Maybe people aren't so different." Her throat tightened. "You always find the lesson in everything, don't you?" He smiled, faint and tired, only when you're around to point it out. They stood there in silence, listening to the last drops on the roof. Then Maggie took a step closer, the candlelight catching the gold in her eyes. "You're a good man. Jonas Whitaker." He gave a quiet laugh. "You keep saying that. I might start believing it. You should." When she reached for his hand, he didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined, simple, unhurried, inevitable. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and wild sage. Later, when they carried Abby to her bed, Maggie paused at the doorway, watching the child sleep. "She'll remember nights like this," she said. "The sound of rain, the safety." "She'll remember your voice," Jonas murmured. "That's what healed her." Maggie turned, emotion shimmering in her eyes. "It wasn't just me." He touched her cheek lightly. "Maybe not, but it started with you." When they returned to the parlor, the fire had dwindled to embers. Jonas poured 2 fingers of whiskey into tin cups, handing her one. "For the storm survived." She smiled. "And for what comes after." They clinked the cups softly. Outside, the night sky cleared, revealing a scatter of stars sharp as pinpricks of glass. The land glistened, washed clean. Maggie stepped out onto the porch, bare feet against the cool boards, the air damp and sweet. Jonas followed, draping a blanket over her shoulders. "You'll catch cold." "I'll risk it," she said, smiling. "This is my favorite part. When the world is still." He nodded. "When everything feels forgiven." She leaned against him, her voice barely a whisper. "Jonas, do you ever wonder if peace is real or just a moment between storms?" He looked toward the horizon, thoughtful. "Maybe it's both. But if this is what peace feels like, I'll take it however long it lasts." They stood together as the wind moved through the fields, carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden below. It was a quiet kind of miracle one earned through storms, loss, and love that refused to break. And for the first time in years, neither of them looked toward the horizon in fear of what might come next. Autumn crept into Red Creek quietly, softening the edges of summer's brightness. The mornings turned cool enough for breath to mist, and the first leaves began to bronze the cottonwoods that lined the river. Life on the ranch slowed, harvest done, fences mended, the rhythm of the season gentle and familiar. Maggie loved this time of year. The air felt honest somehow, stripped of heat and pretense. She spent her mornings drying herbs by the kitchen window, humming under her breath while Abby practiced reading aloud at the table. Jonas usually worked outside until dusk, returning each evening with the smell of wind and hay clinging to him. They had slipped into a peace that felt almost fragile in its perfection, but sometimes, as the sun set, Maggie would catch Jonas staring off toward the horizon, a faraway look in his eyes. When she asked what he was thinking, he would smile and say, "Just counting blessings." She never pushed. She knew there were ghosts. Blessings could not erase. One afternoon, while clearing out the old barn loft, Maggie found something unexpected, a leather-bound journal, weathered but intact, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed feed sacks. She carried it down carefully, brushing away dust. Inside the front cover, in faded ink, was the name Eleanor Whitaker. Her breath caught. She sat on the edge of the hay cart, turning the pages slowly. The handwriting was delicate, looping, the entries brief but intimate lists of chores, thoughts on Abby's first steps, simple prayers, and then, near the end, a line that made Maggie's heart twist. "If he ever learns to smile again, I'll know I did something right." Maggie closed the book gently. For a long moment, She just sat there, the silence thick around her. Then she rose and walked toward the house, the journal pressed to her chest. Jonas was fixing a hinge on the porch when she approached. "I found something," she said softly. He straightened, wiping his hands. When she handed him the book, his face changed. First surprise, then something tenderer, almost reverent. "I thought this was gone," he murmured, running his thumb along the worn spine. "She used to write in it after Abby was born." He sat down heavily, opening the journal to the last page. His lips moved as he read, eyes glinting in the fading light. Maggie didn't speak. She simply stood beside him until he closed the cover, exhaling a long, unsteady breath. "She was a good woman," he said at last. "She'd like you." Maggie smiled softly. "Then I'll take that as the highest praise." Jonas looked up, his voice low. "I used to be afraid that loving again would mean I'd forgotten her. But reading this, I think she'd tell me it's all right." "It is," Maggie said. "It's what she hoped for." Later that evening, they placed the journal on the mantel, beside the vase of fresh roses. Abby asked whose it was, and Jonas explained in the simplest words that it had belonged to her mother. The girl touched the cover lightly, tracing the letters with her finger. "Can we keep it here?" she asked. "Always," Jonas said. That night, long after the lamps were out, Maggie lay awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. Jonas's breathing beside her was slow and even, Abby's faint snores echoing down the hall. Peace, real peace, filled the space between them, and yet, beneath it, Maggie felt the tremor of something larger, the understanding that love, when true, doesn't erase what came before. It gathers it in, folds it gently, and keeps moving forward. The next morning, clouds rolled in from the west. By noon, a cold wind swept across the plains, lifting dust into the air. Maggie hurried to secure the herbs and close the shutters. Jonas rode out to bring in the cattle. The sky darkened to the color of pewter, and thunder grumbled somewhere beyond the ridge. By late afternoon, the storm hit a fierce windstorm, all dust and roaring gusts that turned the world to smoke. Maggie held Abby close inside the house, counting seconds between thunderclaps. The walls creaked. Glass rattled in the window panes. "He'll be all right," she whispered, though her heart raced with every crash of wind. When the storm broke hours later, she stepped onto the porch, her hair unpinned and damp with sweat. The world was ghostly fields stripped bare, fences toppled, the air sharp with ozone. Through the haze, she saw Jonas riding in, hat lost, shirt torn, but alive. He dismounted, walking to her with slow, heavy steps. "You're safe," he said, voice hoarse. "So are you," she breathed, and the fear that had held her chest tight finally broke. That night, after the worst had passed, Jonas found Maggie standing by the window again, looking out over the wrecked pasture. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll rebuild," he said simply. "I know," she replied. Then, after a moment, Jonas, "Do you ever wonder why we keep being tested, storm after storm, and still we stand?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe because we're meant to prove that love holds better than fences." She turned, resting her forehead against his chest. "You always find the words." "No," he murmured, holding her close. "You find them for me." Outside, the wind had gone still, leaving the scent of rain and turned soil. The roses by the porch bent but did not break. In the half-light of dawn, they shimmered, edges jeweled with water fragile and enduring all at once. Maggie watched them, a small smile touching her lips. "Look at that," she said quietly. "They've survived every storm." Jonas followed her gaze. "So have we." And as the sun rose over Red Creek, touching the world with gold, the ranch stood battered but whole, alive with the promise that some things, once rebuilt on truth, could weather anything. By the time the first frost touched the valley, Red Creek seemed to exhale in relief. The storm had passed, the fences were mended, and the land, though scarred, stood steady again. The roses Maggie had nursed through the long summer still bloomed late, stubborn and crimson against the pale light. She often said they reminded her of grace fragile but relentless. Jonas had been quieter lately, though not in the way of sorrow. His silence carried a purpose. Each day, Maggie caught him studying her when he thought she wasn't looking. That slow, thoughtful gaze that always made her pulse quicken. Abby, who noticed everything, had started giggling whenever Jonas lingered too long near the kitchen doorway or accidentally joined them in the garden. One crisp morning, while Maggie hung linens to dry, Abby came running from the barn, cheeks flushed, breathless with excitement. "Papa's building." Something Maggie smiled. "Your father's always building something." "No, it's special," Abby said, tugging her hand. Come See Maggie followed her across the yard, the grass silvered with frost. Behind the barn stood Jonas, hammer in hand, a small wooden arch rising from the ground. Its frame was made of cedar and wild rose branches woven through it, their thorns carefully trimmed. Maggie stopped short, her breath catching. "Jonas, what is this?" He turned, eyes crinkling. "Something Edna and Reverend Reed helped me plan. I figured if we were going to make this place truly ours, we ought to start with a promise." She blinked, her hands trembling. "You mean—" He set the hammer down and wiped his palms on his jeans. "I mean I'd like to marry you, Maggie O'Connell, properly. Not because you came here by accident, not because of what we lost, but because of what we found." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "Jonas," he stepped closer, his voice low, "you said yes once already. I'd just like to make it official before another storm rolls in." She laughed softly, covering her mouth. "You couldn't wait until spring, no," he said simply. "You don't wait on something that's already true." By December, Red Creek shimmered under snow. The wedding was small. Reverend Reed, Edna Larkin, Sheriff Donovan, a few neighbors who'd become family. They gathered beneath the arch Jonas had built, now wrapped in ribbons and evergreen. The air was cold enough to blush cheeks and turn breath into clouds, but the sky was clear, a blue so deep it looked almost holy. Maggie wore a simple ivory dress Edna had sewn from muslin, with a shawl around her shoulders and a small rose pinned to her hair. Jonas stood tall beside her, coat pressed, hat in hand, the roughness of his hands at odds with the gentleness in his eyes. Abby clutched a basket of petals, scattering them carefully along the snow-dusted ground. When Reverend Reed opened his Bible, the pages fluttered in the wind. "We stand here today," he said, "to bless a union not of convenience, but of courage. To love after loss is to defy despair itself." Jonas reached for Maggie's hands, his fingers warm even in the cold. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Neither did I," she whispered. Reed smiled, eyes soft with age. "Jonas Whitaker, do you take this woman, who came into your life as a stranger and stayed as grace, to be your wife?" "I do," Jonas said without hesitation. "And Margaret O'Connell," Reed continued, "do you take this man, who once closed his heart to the world, To be your husband, I do, she said, voice breaking, though her smile was steady. Edna dabbed at her eyes, muttering, about time, when Reverend Reed pronounced them husband and wife. Jonas leaned forward and kissed Maggie softly, reverently, like a man who had spent years learning the language of patience. The guests clapped and cheered, their laughter rising like bells. Abby threw the last of her petals into the air and shouted, "I told you God sent her." The sound rippled through the crowd, and Maggie laughed through her tears. She knelt, gathering Abby close. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "Maybe he did." That evening, the house glowed with lamplight and laughter. The table overflowed with roasted chicken, bread, and Edna's famous apple pie. Reverend Reed told stories from his youth. Sheriff Donovan played a fiddle someone had dusted off from the attic, and Abby danced barefoot in front of the fire. When the last guest had gone, and the world outside was silent again, Jonas found Maggie standing by the window, gazing out at the snow. Moonlight poured over the fields, silvering the land. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Still can't believe you said yes again," he murmured against her hair. "I can't believe you asked in winter," she teased. He chuckled. "You forget. I'm a rancher. I don't wait for perfect weather to do what needs doing." She turned in his arms, smiling up at him. "You're impossible. And you're home," he said softly. She rested her forehead against his chest. "That I am?" They stood there for a long while, the quiet broken only by the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the fire. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, soft, endless. Later that night, Maggie sat at the desk by the window and opened her journal. She wrote one final entry, her pen moving slowly. "I came here to deliver a message for another woman. I thought I was meant to end something, but instead, I began again. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that love doesn't always arrive on time, but it always arrives when the heart is ready." She laid down her pen and looked over at Jonas, asleep by the fire. Abby curled up under his arm. The sight filled her chest with a peace so complete it almost hurt. She whispered to the quiet room, "Thank you." The wind outside sighed against the window pane, gentle this time, like an answer. And in that small house, on the edge of the western plains, beneath the whispering pines and the stars above, two hearts that had wandered too long finally came to rest, proof that even the wrong bride can become the right miracle. The story, she wasn't the bride he ordered, but his daughter said, "God sent you after all," reminds us that true love doesn't always come at the right time, but always comes when the heart is brave enough to open. It teaches that loss is not the end sometimes. It's just the door to start over. We've all been hurt, been afraid to love again, thought that age or the past has closed all opportunities. But if we dare to believe, dare to forgive, dare to step over fear once happiness is still waiting at the end of the road. For those who have passed half of their life, the message of this story is, you can still start over at any age, as long as your heart still knows how to beat. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more warmth and humanity every day.